add your questions to the chat. I'll be taking a look and trying to weave them into our conversation with a little bit of time at the end for more one-on-one conversation with our guest speaker for today, Laura. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Laura, thank you so much for joining. I know this is a topic that's very close to your heart. And as the founder and director of Execs Ondeck, I know you have a lot to say when it comes to what execs are looking for in their next startup role. So I'd love to hand it over to you to introduce yourself, share a little bit about your career journey, and a little bit about what you're doing with Execs Ondeck.
Yeah, happy to. So thrilled to be here, and great to meet this group. Certainly see some faces I recognize. And yeah, so quick summary sort of on my background. So I spent my whole career pretty much in startups and innovation. So it started my first company while I was still in college with some friends. They continued running it and sold it several years later. I stepped out quite early. I came from humble beginnings and needed a job that paid for, things like food. And so I left for Google. I spent almost a decade there, had just an incredible run, was very early at GoogleX, and got to work on launching delivery drones and self-driving cars and smart contact lenses. And then, kind of left for and had a couple exec level roles at mission-driven startups. And it was really in those roles that I found that I loved the work. I loved the people that I was working with, and I really missed having a peer community. I feel like when you're at Google, there are a lot of other people that are at your level, and you can have those kind of like honest, vulnerable discussions about things that you're working on, things that aren't going super well, maybe, how you're thinking about next steps in your career. And then, you move into a VP or C-suite role at a startup, and suddenly like everyone kind of wants an answer from you and is looking to you to sort of provide, reassurance and things like that. And so Execs Ondeck really came from my own personal pain point. And I had been familiar with Ondeck really back before it was a company, when it was a group of us doing dinners, and just found a ton of value there. And so pitched them on, startup execs are a huge high leverage audience that has enormous impact on what the next generation of innovation looks like. And we don't do that much to support them. And so we had an amazing first cohort, and we're gearing up and recruiting now we have a couple spots left in our second cohort. And it's just an incredible group of leaders that have, these great conversations that are, the kinds of conversations you can have with a true peer. So, how you're thinking about your career, how you're thinking about leveling up your leadership, things like that.
Thank you. So I just shared a link in case anybody wants to look into some of Laura's work with Execs Ondeck and the program with Ondeck. Very cool that you were with Ondeck's journey from the beginning and actually attending some of the dinners. That's really cool. Definitely a moment in history. And yeah. Something that you mentioned there around how it seems like execs at startups in particular end up being the catch-all for any crisis, any question. And so you're really stretched in terms of your scope of responsibility. It's maybe not as defined as, hey, you're going to lead this 20-person team and, in an enterprise, level company, it might look very different. So I'm curious, what do executives confide in you as their top priorities when seeking a job with a startup?
Honestly, I hear the same two things over and over. And, I think one is the sort of mission, both in terms of the company's mission, which is like the obvious one. Are you inspired that this is doing good in the world? But also the sort of like mission and values alignment around team culture. So like, how does a startup treat their employees? Like, what is kind of the behind the scenes in these really stressful environments, which are startups. And then two is the space to run. Like so many people leave cushy jobs because they just want more space to run. They want like a broader scope of responsibility, and they want to just move faster and more cross-functionally.
For sure. I think there is that feeling that you're hitting the ceiling too quickly in a large organization where you might be in maintenance mode. So startups definitely give you that space to run, and it can be chaotic, but there's always that upside. I'm curious, what can recruiters and talent leaders, perhaps founders, hiring managers, what can they do to attract executives from large companies to join an early stage startup? And, I've heard the phrase of it's your job to convince a candidate to run to hell and back with you when it comes to joining a startup. So
That is true.
what are some, ways to attract execs to a startup?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that people sort of forget, which is the obvious answer, is like selling that big vision, and having really specific stories that show that that's real and that like, that they really are going to have, space to run, that we really are living out, a certain set of values in a company. And so I think that's really the answer. And then, I know you and I had been talking a little bit previously about sort of like best practices around how do you message those execs. And I think that, and this is like, maybe this is a hot take, but I think startups get how to de-risk a company in an exec's mind totally wrong, when they're in that process. And I think that, startups, I see a lot of startups that they're ready to hire someone very senior and they feel very self-conscious that they're sort of like small and scrappy and early. And they sort of jump into trying to make themselves look bigger when actually, and they de-risk by like sharing brand names of schools, former employees, investors, things like that. And actually what's more compelling is to really pitch yourself as small with a steep growth curve. And so I think showing that momentum of signs of product market fit, trend data, really like pitching that I think everyone is excited about the idea of joining something early that's going to be huge. And, I think you hear sometimes about hiring that you should hire someone for their slope and not their y-intercept. And I think companies sort of forget that that's true for leaders that are looking to join a company as well. I think if you can, that goes both ways. And leaders who want to join companies want a really steep slope and not the y-intercept.
Yeah, I think that is really great advice. And, I think a lot of that messaging can be difficult, especially when, headhunters are trying to reach out to passive candidates, especially if they have a stable job, how do you de-risk that? So thanks for touching on that. I guess speaking a little bit more specifically about messaging or outreach to executives for job opportunities, what are some of those best practices? If you could maybe share some examples that you've seen.
I think it just is getting tactical about that de-risking piece that we were just talking about. And so I think that, going beyond it's hard to be excited about like leaving a big cushy job at Google for a startup because the founder went to HBS or worked at Google or something like that. Whereas I think, really taking the time to sell like, this is the vision, this is like the scrappy early excited like SWAT team that is going in, to that is kind of the David and Goliath wanting to conquer that mission. I think that it's folks talk about that a lot, but actually the tactical piece of delivering on that by like taking a ton of time in the first conversation to like dive deep into the problem statement, is super, super important. And then on the de-risking piece, I think similarly, like taking that time to show that early traction through data or through even introducing an exec to thrilled customers, in those early, recruiting phases. Like I don't think I've ever seen that happen in a startup recruiting process. And there's just no reason why you shouldn't use like great enthusiastic users, to help you close strong execs. It's just like such an emotional, you're not going to be able to offer them the salary and the benefits and things like that, but that emotional piece, like startups have, in droves.
Absolutely. So finding those mission-driven people who are really connected to the vision and being able to sell that story. As we were chatting about storytelling and vision, I just thought about, of course, Andy Raskin, who is amazing with talking about strategic narrative. So I just popped his link in the chat if anyone is curious about strategic narrative, or I just think for the recruiting folks in the room, really great thought leadership on storytelling and, really being able to communicate a vision in the market. So I appreciate that inspiration, Laura. And my next question is, what are some of the do's and don'ts when interviewing executives? So let's say that, you are able to get a really great candidate pipeline of executives for a role. What are some do's and don'ts when interviewing them?
Honestly, I see one mistake in interviewing execs in like 99% of exec startup interviews. And it's always the same mistake, which is, you know, interviews with an exec for a startup role should, especially once they're meeting with senior folks on the team, should feel super collaborative. Like, yes, this is someone who will do a functional role. You should gut check, like, are they actually capable of being, a CTO or whatever? But truthfully, this is someone who's going to be on the leadership team, hire a huge percentage of future folks in the company, be a huge driver of culture, business cadence, driving all hands. Like, this is someone who's going to have a much broader scope than just their functional expertise. And so I think the interview, super important that you're like pushing on them and kind of like sharing current thoughts on mission values and those business cadences and things like that, and getting their input. I think asking for their input on those broad business questions kind of does two things. One is it lets you show them that you value the full range of their experience, but it also lets them show you that they are able to add value there. I think that it's the worst case scenario is that you bring on a CTO that is an amazing technical talent who is terrible at building out the team. And so I think the biggest thing is that, like, making sure that those interviews feel super collaborative and that you're both aware that this is going to be a relationship that's much more than a single role.
That's really great advice. I think, a lot of the times execs might be owning a function at a larger company, but within a startup, they are very much a cross-functional team leader. And even part of de-risking the opportunity is knowing that they have a say and influence in, the company strategy, right? That they're not going to be left off into a silo at all. So that's really great advice, and being able to, I guess, have more panelists on the interview and being able to see how that relationship unfolds and whether or not there's going to be, a smooth cross-functional leadership presence. So thanks for calling that out. In terms of do's, is there something that you've seen a startup do really well, or maybe something that an executive shared with you that, this is what made me choose XYZ company?
The one that I see the most is probably, and this is sort of the touchy-feely answer, but is the vulnerability piece. So, execs coming into a startup, founders maybe have like a bit of an instinct to like put a sheen over how everything is and how it's going and what the problems are. And I think that any leader knows that, especially at an early stage startup, like there is going to be plenty of chaos, plenty of stuff isn't working, processes are breaking. Like that's just kind of part of the process. And so I think bringing an exec in on the interview process and saying, here are the things that are going really well, here's the trend lines, signs of product market fit, or whatever the right, based on the stage of the startup, kind of showcase metrics are, like definitely share those, but also really bringing them in on, here are the things that we're really struggling with. And I think one, it like builds trust with the exec, and two, you know, it lets you see if they're going to be able to add value to those conversations.
Got it. Yeah, I think it is tough to want to impress and not share too much too soon, but at the same time, they really need to have a clear, transparent view. And so you really have to be dialing up what are the genuine positives, but then also being super transparent with, this is our chaos, this is the challenge, this is the opportunity. When it comes to equity, what have you seen executives' perspective on equity, you know, as opposed to the average job candidate?
So this is one, and I'm curious actually if you guys like agree, like if you agree or disagree, drop like a yay or nay in the chat if you'd be willing to. This is one where what I see at least is most execs that are jumping to startups from bigger companies know way less about equity, like how it works and what they should expect than you think. And I often see comp discussions will stall for startup execs just because neither side has quite enough data to feel that they're confident that they're getting a good deal. And so a friend of mine actually runs a very mission-driven edtech startup and has a great hack for this. And what he does is he sends out, we used to tease him about this, but he sends out a printout of benchmark startup comp data for similar roles from Pave or one of these other databases, and with his offer letters to execs. And I think it does two things. One is it's a trust builder. They're going to Google that anyway. So show that you care enough to take the time to understand their value in the market and understand, you know, kind of demonstrate that you're really thinking it through. And two, I think it gives both sides a shared reference point that's based in data and not emotion, because equity, especially in the early stage, is really more of an art than a science. And so, you know, someone's reaction to X% versus Y%, I think finding ways to move from that emotional reaction to data is super helpful.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a considerable theme when trying to attract talent into the startup space, particularly executives. And, you know, to your point, they may not be as well versed with the equity piece, is to appeal to emotions rather than try to win them over with the information or data, if that's sort of a blind spot to begin with. I do see that Mary Jo agreed and said, yes, this seems to be something that execs are not as well versed in. I wonder, Mary Jo, do you want to hop off and share some thoughts? And it's okay, you can say pass in the chat if not.
Well, I would just, I'm director of talent for a private equity firm. So we start companies all the time. And I will say it's the hardest sticking point. Like we get to base comp, we're so excited about the role. But I would say it isn't just our new tech execs that have questions. Even our like investment team always has some new approach. Maybe we should do it this. So I feel like it's both ways. I feel like the leaders have generally never had equity in anything before where I live, except for like stock from a company they've worked. They've never had like private equity before. But then our team is always trying to make it better and do it a little differently. So I'm not always like together either, but it's definitely the hardest part, or the lengthiest part of the conversation.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's exactly what I see. And it really is, it's such a good point that it really is both sides, because I think everyone wants, most people don't go in with like a number that they have to reach. They just want to get to a feeling of fairness, like that they are fairly compensated. And so when both the hiree and the hirer don't have a solid sense of like what this should look like, and maybe it's impossible to have a solid sense of what that should look like, then, you know, I think it gets quite drawn out. And so I do think inserting any sort of, like, we have a lot of execs on deck fellows that come in and say, I have no idea how I should even be thinking about this. Like, I have no idea what the benchmark is. Like, is this way off base? And I think like having that peer community of people who can say, oh, I got this offer and it was this, or oh, my friend just accepted an offer and it was this, and just having like any sort of data point is so useful. And I think employers, what I loved about what my friend did is like employers who add a data point to that list, like it's just such a good like trust building exercise and kind of moment in this process that can get pretty stuck.
I agree. We have also sent out like information sheets about equity, like will it or will it not affect your taxes? When does it become, all those different sort of FAQs, because that's the other portion, is to know like what it really means and how it affects your personal finances as it vests or anything like that.
Yeah, that's such a good idea. And I think like so few people, that's probably a separate conversation, but I think so few people understand the personal finance implications of equity, and so being like a partner there is invaluable.
Yeah, I think just being able to break down that information and really tally up, what are those expectations with your equity package once you sign on, and really, being able to kind of coach the candidate through what the package means. But I think just going back to what you were saying, Laura, it's that feeling and the emotional, milestone that you want to hit, that someone's excited to sign the package, and that might not really have much to do with the equity or the compensation, and it goes back to that vision, that mission, and really being great with aligning that vision to the candidate's motivations. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what the top 3 qualities that make an executive world-class, what would those be?
I think in terms of startup execs that I see just absolutely crush it, I think there are really 2 that stand out. And so one is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Scott Adams, who created Dilbert, but he has this idea of talent stacking. And so, by his assessment, he considers himself a pretty mediocre artist, mediocre at business, but he says that combo of combining the 2 made him really unique and interesting, and certainly has made him lots of dollars. And I think similarly, I think there are other sort of talent stacks that are really compelling. So like an engineer that is an incredible communicator is going to be able to get a job at any startup that they want, even more so maybe than someone who has like an incredible technical talent in a really specific field. So I think that talent stacking is super important, because leadership roles at startups are large and nebulous, and they change very quickly. And so I think if you're hiring an exec at a startup, you're much better off hiring somebody who can flex than someone who may be even the best at the world in the world at something. And if you are hiring for that specific skill, get a contractor, an advisor, like don't hire a leader into your company. So I think that talent stacking is one. And the second one is the sort of culture hiring piece. So your early leadership is, as we talked about, is going to have like this huge impact on what the rest of your company looks like. It's very possible, if you're hiring a C-suite leader, that in a year or 2, a quarter of your company is going to be in the mold of this person that you just brought on. And so I think having somebody who is low ego, sort of super thoughtful about helping develop others, inspiring and warm, and a good organized, clear communicator, and all of those sort of like basic soft skills, I think makes a huge difference, because there's so few right answers, especially in the early stages at startups, that what's going to matter more is somebody who can show up, can inspire other people to bring sort of their best work to the table, and is going to be like a steady force when things get really challenging.
Yeah, I think so much of it is expectation management, right? So communicating around expectations rather than having the right answers. And, as the whole building a plane as you're flying it, there are no answers necessarily as that's happening, but just somebody who can be calm and be able to, just anticipate what the questions are, across different teams, and not just focusing solely on the function that they've been hired into, as you mentioned. We hear it all the time that you want to hire a generalist, not necessarily a specialist when you are early stage, but that goes all the way up to the exec level. So appreciate you bringing that point up. I do see 2 comments in the chat, so let's quickly unpack those. So Mary Jo, kind of, going back to our equity question. So she's found personally, it can be tricky to really sell candidates on the vision. Even if, where it is possible, she feels that she does have to let them know that equity could be worth 0 one day 2. Does anyone else feel that pressure to share that, this could, be that transparent about it? Of course, you want to sell the candidate, but be transparent. Just curious if anyone wants to chime in.
And I just feel like because they don't understand equity, if I've spent the whole recruiting process telling them how amazing it's going to be, I feel like I also have to say, but this is risky. It's a startup. I don't know if anyone else does that, but I have that open conversation.
Yeah, again, that expectation setting. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I was going to say too, I think Eric Torenberg, who is like the founder of Ondeck, has a great spiel on this around the difference between sort of career risk and job risk. And I think that kind of that sentiment plays into this as well, where, I think telling them like, yes, the equity could and probably will be worth nothing just based on statistics one day is super important. And again, is like another trust building moment. I also think that the value of, in terms of like long-term career risk, if you work at a startup that doesn't work out, is actually pretty low, because you probably still like learn something, you had a huge job, you increased your network, like there are a bunch of pluses there. Whereas the job risk of working at a startup versus a Google or Facebook, much higher, like more likely that you're going to be laid off or the company goes out of business or things like that. But I think, I think being really honest about both the risk, but also putting it in that frame of, an exec. I think our execs often go in with a lot of pressure on themselves of this next role has to be like my final role, is something I hear all the time in interviews and in conversations. And I think many of them, it was interesting in the first cohort to watch, I think some of them still really feel that way, which I certainly understand. And I think many of them actually decided kind of over the last couple of months that isn't true, and that they probably have like a couple more swings at bat, and taking a risk on something they're really excited about is still worth it.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think something that you mentioned around that pressure that this needs to be my last and final role, I think this even could be sort of like a cultural shift, right? So, we grew up watching our parents, or like at least their parents, have a steady job, and so like that's the one job that you have for a decade or 2 decades. So I think it is that like cultural resistance as well. So yeah, it's really great to hear that execs in your program are shifting away from that and being more open to seeing this as a job risk, not a career risk, and that opportunity to learn versus earn if things go south. The next
and I
comment.
think
Yeah,
I was just going to say the other, before we switch off that one, I just have to say like the other thing that's so real right now that is worth saying out loud is there's so many layoffs happening in startups right now, and like the funding is so challenging and all of that. So I think also like having a really honest conversation about like the environment is even more chaotic now than it is normally. I think I've seen a couple of founders actually that were trying to hire exec roles and kind of just like papered over, like someone asked about that and they sort of like papered over like, oh no, we'll definitely raise our next round. And I think that's like a huge red flag. And sort of founders and recruiters might be tempted to say that without really thinking about it. And it definitely like raises a flag for a candidate.
Yeah, there's that component of ethics, and you want it to be an ethical closing call or closing conversation. So Mary Jo, I think it's great that you're being transparent. I think it's, again, just bringing them back to that emotional milestone that Laura mentioned while being transparent of the risks. Tobi had a comment here around talent stacking. Tobi, if you want to hop off mute, I'd love to hear where else you heard about talent stacking.
Oh yeah, wasn't planning to unmute, but yeah, I think it was just in a conversation with a friend as well, and just trying to understand, whenever it is that you're trying to pick up a new skill and everything, like sure, the new shiny thing as a skill, right, is something you might want to do, but obviously when looking at candidates as well, trying to see how the different experiences that they've had that might not traditionally come off or jump off the page as the most ideal candidates can actually end up being people that make a good fit, in roles that you're looking for. And I think that also helps as a recruiter to be very sort of like curious about what the company is doing and beyond the surface, what is the company involved with, what challenges are they facing, because then you can end up figuring out what the right stack is, right? As opposed to just, oh, this person has worked in the same industry for 15 years, so they might be a good fit. But yeah, talent stacking is definitely something I'm trying to research a bit more into to just figure out the nuances around it. Just a comment I was making, not really wanting
Yeah.
to share anything. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing though, and it's cool to hear that term come up for you twice in a week. Anything you want to add there, Laura?
No, I love that it's making the rounds. I'm such a fan of that, and I think it's such an interesting way to look at careers because
Mhm.
we have Heather, who's actually one of our like amazing executive coaches for Execs on Deck, is on this call, and something that I feel like I hear from her in conversations with fellows a lot is that people that have gotten to a certain point in their career have had probably like a meandering, interesting path and have done a mix of things. And, I think traditional exec recruiting often is looking for someone who's done exactly what they're going to do in this next role before that you can plug in. And truthfully, those people are almost never the right person for that role because either if they're willing to do it again, they maybe weren't that good at it because they don't want a challenge to do something different. Or I just see people waste a ton of time trying to find that like this person executed exactly this thing in exactly the same kind of startup before,
Yeah.
and there just aren't that many people that fit that description. You're better off getting someone again with like that super steep slope
Mhm.
that has an interesting mix of talents.
Yeah. I think I saw a hand go up. It's Toby. Feel free to.
Yeah, no, just something that Laura just shared raised a follow-up question here, which is, so obviously founders also face this thing where they also are just looking for that shiny new person that has exactly the experience that they're looking for. So in your experience, I know obviously you're speaking from a talent side of the conversation, but how do you convince founders to, again, lean into this talent stacking mindset or just trying to find people that don't necessarily fit on the surface, but obviously have different pieces that make them a good candidate?
So this is how I do it. I don't know if everyone can get away with it, but I'm a big believer of you can say very honest things if you say them with warmth and good intention. And so I have had several conversations with founders about this exact topic where they were beating their head against the wall, looking for something that like clearly to anyone else didn't exist and like didn't want someone who had had even slightly different experience from what they were about to do. And what I end up doing is kind of pointing out to them that they have not done what they're doing right now before. And like certainly, you probably believe in them and think that they're doing a great job. And so the idea that their leadership team should have done exactly what they're about to bring them on to do before is just like equally ridiculous. And I think if you say that with like genuine good intent and warmth and you have a good trusting relationship with someone, like I think you can sometimes kind of see they like kind of are like, yeah, you're not wrong. It helps kind of shift the mindset.
Nice, nice. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
It's a radical candor moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think last question on my end before I open it up to everyone else in the room. So everyone, if you want to think about your questions that you have for Laura, either add them to the chat or raise your hand and I'll call your name. You can either continue to add questions to the chat once I call your name or hop off mute. And yeah, I guess one thing that I'd love for you to share, Laura, I know you shared your LinkedIn, but what are some other ways to connect with you and other ways to learn about Execs on Deck?
Yeah, so we're furiously reviewing applications for our second cohort, which kicks off October 18th. And I think I'm sure this group is very well connected. So if you know anyone who would be a good fit, feel free to shoot me a note on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at Laura.Thompson at Ondeck.com. We can drop it in the chat. And I think really who we're looking for, sort of tactically, are folks with 12 plus years of experience who want to build big careers in startups. They could be current startup execs looking to level up, or senior folks elsewhere in big tech or other companies that are looking to make the leap into startups. But really what we're screening for is, at this point, we sort of take for granted that people have very impressive, leadership experience and impact. And we're really looking for people that have sort of that community service first mindset, because, as I'm sure you guys are familiar, to get the value out of a community, you have to do a certain amount of investing in that community. And we find that people that show up to, if you have, say, 4 one-on-one conversations with other fellows in the program, 3 of them are maybe good conversations and nothing really comes of it. And the 4th turns out to be someone you really hit it off with, who is like a lifelong confidant and mentor, and you end up working together and things like that. And so, we're really looking for folks that have that sort of service first mindset, because those folks show up to those 4 conversations kind of like ready to catch that pot of gold at the end.
It's a great way to put it. I know that I've had plenty of lunch club matches where I kind of question, why am I still using this platform? But then every so often you meet someone who, may change your life, like some really life-changing connections occurring online here. That's what I love about communities as well, curated communities. Speaking of which, for those who are not familiar with the hiring community, I'm going to go ahead and pop our FAQ doc in the chat for folks that are not familiar with the hiring community. And I'll also go ahead and drop our website. And I realized I didn't introduce myself in the beginning. So I am Neha. I'm the founder of the hiring community, which was previously known as Ondeck Recruiting. And so if you are a founder, recruiter, or people leader looking to find your peers, learn, share, and grow, please do check out the links in the chat and feel free to apply. So Heather has a comment here. It only takes that one connection to transform a career. Yeah, that is quote worthy. I need to print that and put that up in my office. Speaking of Heather, since you are part of the Execs on Deck program, not to put you on the spot, but kind of doing that here, if you wanted to hop off mute and share a little bit of your insights from coaching executives in the program, feel free to hop off. Oh, okay, not on video, en route.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting the wisdom in the chat.
Yeah, no worries. My cell phone service is spotty, so that's the only reason I didn't jump off mute a little earlier.
All good. Yeah, I appreciate you joining the session either way, and definitely, going to keep that nugget of wisdom in my pocket. I want to make sure that with the next 10 to 20 minutes, in case there's questions or thoughts, comments, if anyone wants to raise their hand or drop questions in the chat, or else I might just do some wildcard questions with Laura. So while people are thinking, Laura, I'd be curious, just going back into your background working with GoogleX, what were some of the projects that you were leading there? And tell us more about your career there, or your, highlights there.
Yeah, so sort of quick summary there. So when I joined GoogleX, I'd been at Google for a handful of years, and actually one of my favorite mentors, who was a VP at Google at the time, told me I was throwing my career away by accepting the offer at X, because I was like moving up. I was leading a global team, kind of working on a core business kind of business line, and X was this very untested thing where I would start off as an individual contributor again. And so it was an interesting career move. And I think the insight for me personally is that I'm very motivated by like who I'm working with and how excited I am. And, there are pros and cons to that. But I knew that I think a lot about like choosing the set of problems you want to deal with. And I feel like the set of problems of making the jump to X was this unknown, but I was going to work with really cool people on cool stuff, even if it exploded, versus the set of problems of sort of climbing the ladder and always wondering if I had missed out. So kind of disregarded his advice. And while I was at X, I really worked on a mix of everything. So, I feel super lucky. I was there in the very early days. I was one of the first non-engineers on the ground. And so I got to really essentially I would partner with like top technical talent in the world and be the all things non-technical in getting projects to launch. And so the delivery drone company that's now spun out as Wing was something that we partnered on really early and got to launch and be part of the first couple test flights and I think we delivered dog treats to a farmer in Australia like a million years ago. So just like a huge adventure, and also got to work on the smart contact lens. So helping diabetics, you often have to prick your finger for blood. And we found a way that you could actually just wear a contact lens that would track your glucose levels for you. And we also killed a lot of things along the way and got really good at sort of offering people a big bonus and throwing a party when we killed their project. So thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think I also learned a lot along the way around kind of because it was so early and people were really interested in X at that time, like learned a lot about how to do innovation. So, how to think through that process of doing something really crazy. And yeah, probably a separate session, but lots of thoughts there and lots of things that I think apply to startups as well.
That is so cool. Yeah, I think something that you had talked about previously, I recall, you had mentioned how there was a celebration even for the projects that failed, right? So, so much time, energy, resources go into testing, and we're encouraged to experiment, we're encouraged to fail forward, but sometimes it feels like we're just failing and not doing the forward part in a startup. So I think it's great to celebrate, those moments where we cut our losses or, kill a project, as you said. So what kind of celebrations would you do for teammates that, had to kill a project?
Yeah, so I have two examples actually. So one is at a grand scale. We had a project. It was the sort of Sergey's brainchild. It was a really interesting idea, but we had hired up some of the best people in the world to work on it. They had made some good progress, but they just got to a point where they were like, one, this might not be possible based on the laws of physics. And two, if we, spend years figuring out if this is possible, we're not actually sure that it's solving like a real problem in the world that's going to be meaningful. And so we had the team actually, and so everyone sort of saw the writing on the wall, but we had the team go through the exercise and lead themselves through the exercise of, should we kill this project? And they decided that we should. And so we threw them a huge party, and we had, I can't even remember, we had like ridiculous costumes for them, and we gave everyone the equivalent bonus of taking their family to Disneyland for a week, and had them share a bunch of the learnings along the way. And we found them all different jobs. So I think that's like a big example of killing it. But actually, I think the one that's more applicable is we created laptop stickers that were a circle with a crumpled piece of paper on it, and for people that killed something along the way or like had to sort of dramatically switch gears in a project, they would earn one of these laptop stickers. And a year or two later, you'd see people with like 20 of these stickers on their laptop, and it became, they were very cheap to print laptop stickers, but it became like a huge badge of honor. And it really, I think that more than anything changed the culture, because it's so visible that it's on your laptop, and people would sort of fight to the death with the person who was giving out the laptop stickers of like, no, I really did fail on this and I deserve one of these stickers. And so that's something I recommend to startups all the time of like, that's a cheap way to really change your culture.
I love that. Yeah, that really changes the culture for sure. And again, it's rewarding risk taking and a lot of that, testing that's required, experimenting that's required. But at the end of the day, human nature, we don't want to fail as much as we call it, being the sexy thing in the startup space. So I love that you actually have these tangible ways to reward people, celebrate them, and actually fail forward. So thanks for sharing that anecdote. I see there's a hand up. Isaac, if you want to hop off mute or leverage the chat to chat with Laura.
Hey, thanks everyone for your time. So you mentioned a lot about how do you recruit top execs, I guess, from other companies. But I think, if you're an early stage company and you've got really great talent at the early stage, a priority could be to develop that talent to become execs. And I think by default, they won't have a lot of the exec chops that one would look for when hiring an exec. So I guess, any tips on how do you not properly, but like, how do you develop people to be ready to take on those roles and make it so that you can, confidently communicate to your team at the earliest stage that, hey, look, like we are intentional and we do hope to develop talent internally as opposed to always going externally for more senior hires.
Yeah, I love that, Isaac. And I think that something that I see a lot is people hire too big too soon in terms of external talent when they have really obvious people who have been there internally from the beginning, have given blood, sweat, and tears, and are like ready to step up, but do need some support. And I think I'm probably a little bit biased since I run a community that helps people level up in their exec kind of leadership capabilities and careers. But I do think, if you're going to promote someone internally, make sure that you also spend the sort of time and money to really support them in successfully growing into that role. So, I tell folks a lot, if you're going to save the money on recruiting of promoting somebody internally, like make sure you still invest that money in hiring them a coach or, giving them a peer community by joining, a community of other folks that they're going to be able to kind of lean on and have these more honest conversations with. But, don't just say like, oh, we saved the money doing this and we're excited to hire someone internally. Like really demonstrate that you're going to invest in them to ensure that they're successful in that role.
And would you say the playbook for developing, I guess, internally versus like what you look for in external hire would be similar in terms of like, if I'm going to go out and hire an exec, I've got, let's say 5 things that I'm looking for. Is the goal then to flip it and say, all right, here are the 5 things that we need to develop internally, and then here are the 5 resources that'll get you there?
I think the sort of going back to the talent stacks, like the talent stack for an internal hire that you're going to promote is a little bit different. And probably the difference is that in some way, this isn't always true, but I feel like probably the difference in some ways is that you are trading maybe some level of specific, they've done XYZ skill before for this person really knows the culture and is close to the user and speaks the language. And I think just like being upfront about what that exact trade is in that specific hire's case, I think saves a lot of time because you probably are still looking for something similar, but let's say you're scaling up an edtech company, maybe you have an internal person who hasn't previously scaled an edtech company from X to X people, but the trade-off of like they really get the history, they're amazing at telling the story, they're super inspiring at bring on other people into the company because they like are really a true believer. Like that trade-off is probably worth it and the right call. So I think it's just thinking really explicitly about that trade-off, and maybe even talking to them about it, and figuring out, are they excited to learn XYZ skills that are going to help them execute on that role, but also acknowledging that they do have this set of value that an external candidate just wouldn't.
Got it. And if I can ask one more on that vein, so I think like making a trade-off kind of implies that what the trade-offs are. And so I guess like if you're an early stage company, your founders are relatively young in their career, and they haven't built it. They also haven't built an organization, so they're figuring things out as they go.
Yeah.
How do you know like what trade-offs are the right trade-offs to make, and I guess like how does, if that informs whether or not you go external or you hire or you promote internally, like are there resources? Is the advice go talk to a coach for CEOs to make that call?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge believer in everyone should talk to a coach every once in a while. But I also think this is a piece where advisors are hugely valuable. And I think the best founders that I work with are ones that are amazing at asking and getting advice from advisors. And so I think that's something that you can probably learn from someone who is like friendly and has been in the business and is willing to jump on a 10-minute phone call, that you don't necessarily need to have that expertise in-house. And I also think I've seen a couple recruiters actually that have opened up kind of like intros with potential advisors to help give context on these kinds of conversations. And I'm surprised that more recruiters don't do that, because I think it's such a surprise and delight moment for a founder when a recruiter can say, oh, hey, here's somebody in my network who may be worth a 20-minute call on this. And I would think it adds value kind of both ways.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I see some comments in the chat. Heather was mentioning communities are a great space to leverage, your advisors, people that have been there, done that. And I know that Isaac does a lot of that with, the hiring community. So I know recently he's been looking at implementing a performance management tool. And I think something that I mentioned around leadership development is actually having really tight feedback loops. So I think even before like a system or a tool is implemented, making sure that there is a culture of feedback. And I think that's like a harder thing to do, but it's sort of like where the existing leaders, so if that's just the founder right now and like, that leadership responsibility is being shared across, the current small team, kind of just coming together and figuring out how do we start creating a culture of feedback before we start implementing tools and before we start considering who's moving up and do we need to look outside the org. But hopefully that provides a bit more clarity, Isaac. And I want to make sure that if there's anyone else who has any final comments, questions, while we have Laura on the call, please raise your hand.
If not, I would say, and feel free to decline in the chat, but Jessie, I feel like you have such an interesting perspective on all of these things. And so if there was like a thought or a comment that the conversation sparked, like would love to open a minute for you to share something. And if not, feel free to just decline in the chat. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Sure. I think my only thing was, so I'm always VP product #1 product hire. So I think I've talked to different companies and then they keep telling that, oh, the VP didn't work out, the VP didn't work out. After 3 VPs who did not work out, I think maybe it's time to be introspective. And also I think it's also important to realize that not everybody is perfect, just like all of us here, right? So I think it's important that the everybody knows that you're good at this, you're bad at this, being willing to acknowledge. And I worked with a CEO who just thinks that, oh, because I'm the CEO, you need to listen to. Like, I think there are a lot of different chemistry and that may or may not come up. But again, don't be too quick to fire too. I think because that makes just hiring the next person very difficult, because people ask you, how come you fire that person? Like after 3 VPs of product didn't work out, I think that's a problem that's bigger than whoever you've hired.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And Jessie is one of our amazing inaugural Execs on Deck cohort fellows.
Yep.
So I see that Zoom doesn't let me copy. I do see that Jessie added her LinkedIn URL earlier in the chat if you want to scroll up and check out Jessie's profile. All right. Well, I think we're coming close to time. I'm sure that everyone would appreciate a little bit of time back. I just want to thank you, Laura, for all your insights, your anecdotes, and for spending some time with us talking about what you know about startup leadership and what it takes to hire an executive at a startup and attracting them through a vision and really appealing to emotion and ethical closing. All of that was fantastic. So thanks again, and thank you all on the call for joining and for participating in today's session.
Yeah, huge thanks for having me, and loved all the good questions and insights. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and also I think it's just a huge leverage point that that there's a ton of space for all of us to get better at it. So super excited to continue the conversation, and feel free to shoot me a note anytime if you want to connect or if I can be helpful in any way.
Lovely. So we are meeting tomorrow for a social in case anybody wants to join a bit of recruiting trivia and open mic. So that's happening tomorrow, and you can RSVP through the link in the chat. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure chatting with you all, and have a wonderful day. Thank you. All right.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Neha.
Bye.